snow drifted through the night sky like falling ash. The pines groaned under the weight of winter, their shadows trembling in the wind. Far below, a single light blinked in the endless white, the landing beacon of a rescue plane. It was the last flight of the season, carrying a cargo more fragile than anything else on board, a dozen orphaned wolf pups from failed breeding programs across the Midwest. Their cries were muffled under layers of straw and blankets, but even through the metal walls the sound felt ancient, the kind of sound that once ruled this land. The plane touched down beside the sanctuary, its rotors scattering frost into clouds. A handful of volunteers hurried forward, their boots crunching against ice. Among them stood a small figure wrapped in a wool coat several sizes too big. Lila Anders, 10 years old, the youngest resident of the sanctuary, and an orphan herself. She wasn't supposed to be outside at this hour, but something in the night had called her out. As the crates were unloaded, Lila moved closer. Inside one, a tiny wolf pup struggled to stand, its front leg twisted useless. Its fur shimmered silver gray under the lantern light, and its eyes bright, uncertain, met hers. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. The wind howled through the trees like 1,000 old stories trying to be heard. Then the pup whimpered a soft broken sound that cracked the silence open. Lila reached through the slats of the crate, her mittened hand trembling. The pup pressed its nose against her palm. And just like that, two souls, both abandoned, both searching, found each other in the middle of a frozen night. No one at the sanctuary knew it then, but that moment would change everything. Because in the heart of the coldest winter warmth had found its way back, not through fire, but through trust. What happened next would surprise everyone. Morning came slow to the northern wilderness. The first light crawled across the frozen lake, turning every shard of ice into a blade of glass. The sanctuary lay quiet beneath the pines, a cluster of weathered cabins and fenced enclosures half buried in snow. This was the Northwoods Wolf Sanctuary, one of the last rescue centers in Minnesota, dedicated to rehabilitating injured and orphaned wolves. It wasn't a zoo, not a tourist site, just a place where broken wild hearts learned how to live again. Inside the main cabin, the smell of wood smoke mingled with antiseptic and the faint musk of fur. Metal cages lined the walls, each holding a story that began with loss. Some pups had been found abandoned by hunters. Others, like Shadow, were born in captivity and never learned the language of the forest. Lila Anders knew those stories better than anyone because, in a way, she lived one herself. Lila had come to the sanctuary 2 winters ago after a car accident on a frozen highway left her without family. At 10, she was old enough to understand what death meant, but too young to stop waiting for someone to come back. When no one did, the state assigned her to the care of Margaret Morgan, the sanctuary's director, a woman with gray hair, calloused hands, and eyes that missed nothing. To the outside world, Margaret was all rules. Don't touch the wolves, don't name them, don't get attached. But Lila saw the truth beneath her roughness was someone who had lost too many animals, too many people to believe in permanence. Margaret never spoke about it, but a photograph in her office said enough, a younger version of herself standing beside a male gray wolf, both looking straight into the camera. Wild trust frozen in time. Days at the sanctuary began before dawn. Lila would carry buckets of thawed meat, check water heaters, and record the health notes for every enclosure. She learned to move slowly, to keep her voice low, to listen. Wolves don't respond to fear, Margaret had said once. They respond to respect. But no lesson felt as alive as the one she learned from the crippled pup. Shadow. The name she whispered one night, when no one was listening, had been transferred from a breeding facility that closed down due to funding cuts. Born with a twisted leg, he was deemed unfit for release. Yet somehow the sanctuary took him in, maybe because Margaret saw something worth saving, or maybe because Lila refused to let him be another statistic. At first the pup wouldn't eat. He growled every time she approached, snapping his small teeth at the spoon. But Lila didn't leave. She read books aloud to him, stories about wolves and forests and stars. Her voice, soft and trembling, filled the cold air like a lullaby. One night, Margaret watched from the hallway as the girl leaned against the cage door, whispering, "You're not broken, Shadow. You're just learning to walk in your own way." The pup blinked, then rested its head on her sleeve. Days became weeks. The snow melted, then froze again. Spring never came easy to the Northwoods, but inside the sanctuary something small and persistent grew trust. The place itself was a living ecosystem of compassion and science. Volunteers came from across the country, wildlife students, retired rangers, even pilots from Lighthawk who flew orphaned pups between sanctuaries to expand genetic diversity. Each rescue was part of a national effort, one designed to keep the Red Wolf's bloodline from disappearing entirely. Lila didn't know all those details then. All she knew was that the sanctuary was the first place she'd ever felt safe. No questions about her past, no pity in people's eyes. Just the quiet rhythm of breathing creatures that depended on her. Sometimes at night, she would sneak out to the observation platform overlooking the forest. There she'd hear the distant calls of wild wolves, free ones far beyond the fences. She didn't envy them. She just wondered if they ever felt lonely too. In that remote corner of Minnesota, two lives, one human. One wolf began to intertwine like roots beneath frozen ground. Neither belonged entirely to the world that made them, yet both were learning how to survive within it. And though no one said it aloud, every person at the sanctuary knew. Once a wolf finds its way into your heart, you never really let it go. The day Shadow arrived was already written in the rhythm of the snow. It was March, the kind of March that never learned how to thaw. The sanctuary's radio crackled with updates from the Lighthawk pilot, a small plane inbound transporting the last of the winter rescues. Lila waited near the runway, a strip of cleared ice and gravel that glimmered under the weak morning sun. She clutched a clipboard with her mittened hands, pretending to be one of the staff. In truth, no one had asked her to be there. But when you live your life surrounded by departures, you learn to show up for every arrival. The plane's propeller slowed. The pilot stepped out carrying a crate lined with straw. Inside, a single wolf pup no more than 6 weeks old. Its fur shimmered like tarnished silver. One front leg bent awkwardly inward, twisted from birth or injury. The moment Lila saw it, something in her chest shifted, a quiet ache that felt familiar. She knew what it meant to start life already limping. Margaret took one look at the pup and sighed. "Born with a defect," she said. "We'll stabilize him, but he won't make it in the wild." Her tone wasn't cruel, just factual, the way scientists speak when they've learned to bury their hope under logic. Lila crouched beside the crate. The pup bared tiny teeth, trying to appear larger than he was. She whispered softly, "Hey there, little one. You don't have to fight me." For a moment, it froze, listening. Then, almost shyly, it lowered its head. That was the first time the pup accepted a human voice without fear. In the following days, Shadow's condition worsened before it got better. The cold made the pain in his leg unbearable. Margaret and the vet team wrapped it in gauze, changed it twice a day. Lila stood nearby, watching every movement, as if learning a secret language, the language of healing. Each time the pup whimpered, she flinched. Each time it quieted, she breathed again. The world outside didn't exist beyond those few feet of straw heat lamps and trembling fur. Margaret noticed. "You're getting attached," she warned one evening. Lila looked down at her hands, raw from cleaning cages, smelling of antiseptic. "He needs someone to stay," she said simply. Margaret didn't answer, but she didn't pull her away either. At night, when the generators went silent and the forest swallowed the noise, Lila snuck into the infirmary. She'd sit beside Shadow's crate, reading softly under a dim flashlight. Sometimes fairy tales, sometimes the sanctuary's field manual, as if both could teach him how to live. The pup's ears twitched when she spoke. He began to recognize her footsteps before she entered. Once, when she fell asleep leaning against the crate, Margaret found them at Dawn Girl and Wolf, breathing in rhythm. She didn't scold her. She only whispered, "Don't forget child. He's not yours to keep." Lila didn't answer. She already knew that love doesn't mean possession, but that didn't make it hurt less. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt into rivers that carved through the sanctuary like veins of glass. Shadow could now stand for a few seconds before collapsing. Every time he did, Lila clapped softly. "You're doing it, Shadow, you're doing it." One morning, he took 3 steps on his own. Then 4. Then, with a shaky little growl, 5. It wasn't much, but for them, it was a miracle. By the end of spring, Shadow's coat had thickened, his eyes had brightened. He could limp run across the small pen, chasing fluttering leaves like a child chasing dreams. And every time he stumbled, he looked back just to make sure Lila was still watching. But outside the fences, other sounds were stirring, the deep rolling calls of wild wolves returning north. It was their season again. For Shadow, that sound wasn't just a song. It was a promise, a reminder that one day the world beyond these fences would call him too. That was the day their fates intertwined, not as keeper and captive, but as 2 souls healing in the same light. Spring thawed the land, but not the challenges that came with it. For the sanctuary, warmer weather meant a surge of rescues. Coyotes struck by cars, owlets fallen from nests, and a new litter of malnourished wolf pups abandoned by their mother. It also meant diseases spread faster, fences weakened, and nights were filled with restless howls. Lila's world narrowed to a single rhythm. Wake before dawn, feed, clean, record, repeat. Every moment she wasn't helping the staff, she was with Shadow. He was walking better now, limping yes, but stronger with every day. Still, the leg would never fully straighten. Some days it ached so badly that he refused to stand, curling into a trembling ball. Lila would sit beside him, then, her voice soft, her hands still. Sometimes she read, sometimes she just breathed beside him until his breathing matched hers. Healing was never a straight line. There were days of progress followed by nights of fever. Once a minor infection spread too fast, and the vet said the words that still echo in Lila's mind, "If it reaches the bone, we'll have to amputate." That night, she refused to leave the infirmary. She mixed water with crushed antibiotics and coaxed Shadow to drink. He bit at the syringe, snarling, but she stayed calm, murmuring his name steady as the heartbeat under her palm. By morning, his fever broke, and when the first sunlight touched the windows, he leaned his head against her arm. That was the first time he chose comfort over fear. The bond between them deepened, something unspoken, wordless, like the understanding between rain and soil. Shadow learned her scent, her footsteps, even her moods. He would nudge her hand when she was quiet too long, or stand alert when strangers entered the pen. Sometimes she caught him staring through the wire at the forest beyond, and in his gaze she saw not longing, but memory. Lila had never known family beyond faded photographs and fleeting faces. But now she understood what belonging could mean, the kind that didn't need words, promises, or shared blood. It was the kind that existed in presence. Summer came. The forest exploded into green, the air thick with pine sap and humming insects. With each sunrise, the sanctuary echoed with more life and more rules. Every rescued wolf was catalogued, weighed, and prepared for eventual release. Margaret kept reminding everyone, "We don't raise pets here. We raise second chances." But the line between those two things blurred whenever Lila looked at Shadow. He was no longer the fragile creature from winter. His coat shimmered silver-black in the sunlight. He could run awkwardly, but fast enough to send a spray of dirt behind him, and every time he fell, he rose again. Yet even in his strength there was fragility, the kind only those who have suffered carry. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. Thunder cracked over the pines, the wind bending the fences like paper. The generator sputtered out, plunging the sanctuary into darkness. Lila ran through the storm flashlight flickering, checking every pen. When she reached Shadow's enclosure, he was pacing in panic, the roar of thunder bouncing off the metal walls. She climbed inside without hesitation. Rain lashed against the roof. Lightning lit up the world in white flashes. She wrapped her arms around him, whispering, "It's okay. It's okay. You're safe." Shadow trembled not from fear of her, but from the echo of something ancient, the instinct to flee. And yet, he didn't run. He leaned against her instead. For hours they stayed like that girl and wolf pup, heartbeat to heartbeat, until the storm passed. By morning, the storm was gone. The sanctuary was quiet again, washed clean, renewed. Lila walked out of the pen soaked and shivering, but smiling. Margaret stood by the porch, arms crossed. "You could have been hurt," she said, but her tone lacked anger. "I wasn't," Lila replied simply. "He needed me." Margaret looked at the wolf behind her, then at the girl. And for the first time she didn't argue. She just said, "He's getting stronger. That's good." But what she didn't say, what Lila didn't want to hear, was that every day of strength brought Shadow closer to leaving. Love in the sanctuary was never about keeping. It was about preparing to let go. Still, Lila couldn't stop herself from dreaming. She imagined a future where Shadow might stay, where he'd limp beside her forever, a constant presence in a world that never stayed still. But nature doesn't bargain with hope. It teaches through cycles, not promises. And just as the forest began to whisper of autumn again, fate reminded them both that wild hearts don't belong in cages, even the kind built from kindness. That summer, Lila learned the hardest truth of all, that healing is not about fixing what's broken, but helping it find the strength to walk again. Autumn in northern Minnesota is short, a single breath between summer's hum and winter's silence. The forest burned with color, gold birch-red maple, and the deep green of endless pines. The air sharpened. Frost began to lace the mornings again. For the sanctuary, this was the hardest season. Wolves in rehabilitation grew restless, answering the wild calls beyond the fence lines. Food became scarcer, storms unpredictable, and the staff worked against the clock to prepare for releases before the lakes froze again. For Lila and Shadow, it was a season of change and of quiet dread. Shadow had grown into a young wolf, now his body lean, his gait uneven but determined. He could run almost freely, his limp only visible in longer strides. Margaret and the vets agreed his leg had healed as much as it ever would. He was ready for the next phase, the open field test, the sanctuary's final step before release. When Lila overheard the decision, her chest tightened. Ready for release. It sounded like a victory to everyone else. To her, it felt like a countdown. That evening, she sat outside his pen, whispering, as Shadow pressed his muzzle against the bars. "Do you even know what it means to leave?" she said softly. "Out there, no one will feed you. No one will sing to you when you're afraid." He blinked, then nudged the metal as if to say, "But that's what I'm made for." Days passed in preparation. Trainers moved Shadow into the large, semi-wild enclosure, 200 acres of forest surrounded by reinforced fence lines. Inside, deer roamed streams cut through mossy ground, and the scent of freedom filled the air. It was as close to the wild as the sanctuary could give. For the first few days, Shadow stayed near the gate, pacing, calling out, when Lila's scent drifted from the observation tower. Then, Instinct took over. He learned to stalk, to chase, to disappear into the underbrush like smoke. Lila watched every movement through binoculars, her notes trembling with each sighting. "He's hunting alone now," she wrote. "Still limps on uneven ground, but adapts fast. Responds to no one. Pride mixed with grief in every line." Then, one night, everything changed. A storm moved in from the Canadian border, not a gentle rain, but a roaring front of wind and ice. Power lines snapped, trees fell like matchsticks, and somewhere in the chaos, the outer gate of the open field pen gave way. Margaret's radio crackled. Fence breach section 3B. "Wolves are out." Floodlights cut through the rain as volunteers scrambled with flashlights and tranquilizer rifles. Lila ran toward the forest before anyone could stop her. "Lila, wait!" Margaret shouted. "We'll handle it." But she was already gone, swallowed by the storm. The forest was alive with movement, shadows weaving through rain, wild calls echoing from every direction. Lila slipped her hands sinking into mud, her breath ragged. "Shadow," she screamed, her voice drowned by thunder. Then she saw him half hidden among the trees, his coat slick with rain, his head raised toward the dark sky. He wasn't running. He was standing between her and a pair of glowing eyes just beyond the light. Another wolf, larger, feral, uncollared. Its snarled teeth flashing white. The air vibrated with sound. Lila froze. Shadow moved first. He limped forward low and silent, placing himself between her and the wild stranger. The other wolf lunged, a blur of motion, claws and teeth. The fight was brutal, fast and soundless except for the rain. Mud and fur flew, a flash of red. Lila shouted, stumbled forward, her hands reaching through darkness. When the other wolf retreated, disappearing into the trees, Shadow collapsed. She crawled to him, rain blurring everything. His breathing was shallow but steady. Her trembling fingers brushed over his fur, warm, alive. "You're okay," she whispered, voice cracking. "You're okay." The rescue team found them, minutes later, Margaret leading the way. She lifted her radio to call for the vet, but paused when she saw Lila's face. There was no need for words. Together, they carried Shadow back through the storm, the sound of his faint growls lost in the wind. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was a wreck, branches strewn across the compound, snow melted into mud. But Shadow was alive. He'd lost blood, but his wounds were clean. The larger wolf hadn't gone for the kill, just the warning. Nature had tested him, and somehow he'd passed. Lila sat beside him as he slept, her fingers tangled in the straw. Margaret approached quietly. "You see now," she said, "why he has to go back." Lila nodded, tears streaking dirt across her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, "because he's already gone." A week later, when Shadow took his first steps again, something had changed in his eyes. He still looked at Lila, but no longer for reassurance. He looked as if memorizing her face the way the wild memorizes the shape of its last shelter before moving on. For Lila, it was enough. He'd survived the storm. He'd found his voice. And when he stood beneath the pines, raised his head and howled, for the first time, it wasn't a cry of fear or pain. It was a song of belonging. The other wolves answered from beyond the ridge, distant yet familiar. And in that chorus, Lila finally heard what she'd been denying all along, that his heart no longer beat for the safety of fences, but for the open world beyond them. For the first time, Shadow howled, and it wasn't a plea for help, but a declaration of life. The storm passed, but its echo lingered. The fallen trees were cleared, fences rebuilt, and power restored, yet something unseen had shifted at the sanctuary. Shadow's howl that night had reached beyond the compound. It carried through valleys and over ridges, caught by the receivers of nearby wildlife patrols. Within a week, an official letter arrived from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The wolf with the crippled leg, the one deemed non-releasable, was now to be evaluated for reintroduction. His recovery had defied the medical report. He was walking, hunting, howling, surviving. For the sanctuary, this was a triumph. For Lila, it was the beginning of the end. That evening, the team gathered in the meeting cabin. The air smelled of pine resin and disinfectant. Margaret spoke first, her voice steady. "They're sending an agent next week. They'll assess his behavior and health. If he passes, he'll be moved to the wild acclimation site near Superior National Forest." The volunteers murmured with approval. It was the dream outcome for any rehabilitation. Only one person stayed silent. Lila sat at the far end of the table, hands clenched in her lap. When Margaret noticed, she said gently, "This is good news, Lila. You helped make this happen." But Lila's voice trembled as she replied, "Good news means goodbye, doesn't it?" The room went quiet. No one met her eyes. Over the next few days, preparations began. Shadow's enclosure was expanded for pre-release monitoring. Trainers reduced human contact. No hand-feeding, no talking. No comfort, touches the rules of rewilding were absolute. But Lila couldn't let go that easily. At night, she snuck to his pen, whispering from the shadows. He recognized her voice instantly, tail flicking once before settling. It wasn't the excitement of a pet. It was recognition, ancient and restrained. "You'll forget me out there," she whispered. "But that's how it's supposed to be, right?" Shadow tilted his head, eyes catching the starlight, silent, unanswering. The following morning, two officials arrived in gray jackets marked Wildlife Division. They carried clipboards, tranquilizer kits, and a sense of finality. They spoke with calm efficiency, assessing enclosure integrity, reviewing medical logs, asking about behavioral adaptation. One of them turned to Lila, who stood quietly by the fence. "You're the caretaker." She nodded. "You understand he can't stay. Federal law prohibits permanent captivity for rehabilitated wildlife, except under medical exemption." Lila's voice was small. "And what if his leg fails him again?" "Then the wild will decide," the officer replied, not unkindly. It wasn't cruelty, it was policy. The line between compassion and interference written in ink and law. That night, the sanctuary seemed quieter than ever. Even the forest held its breath. Margaret found Lila sitting outside Shadow's pen, sketching his silhouette in a worn notebook. "Child," she said softly, "letting go isn't punishment. It's trust." Lila looked up, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. "I know, but I'm not sure I trust the world enough." Margaret smiled faintly, the kind of smile built from too many goodbyes. "Then trust him. He's stronger than you think." 2 nights before the scheduled release, an early frost coated the sanctuary. The air smelled like snow. Lila couldn't sleep. Something inside her felt unfinished, like a story missing its last page. She crept outside one last time. The world was silver and silent. Shadow lay near the gate, watching her approach. She crouched, pressing her palm to the cold wire. "I wish I could go with you," she whispered. "Not to keep you, just to make sure you find your way." The wolf stood, limped closer, and pressed his muzzle against her hand. A heartbeat. Then he turned, melting into the darkness. She didn't see him again that night. When dawn came, the staff found the outer latch slightly ajar, not open enough for escape, but loosened. Margaret suspected what had happened, but said nothing. Shadow had returned to his pen before sunrise, sitting calmly as if waiting for permission. No one mentioned it again. But between Lila and Margaret, a quiet understanding passed. Love had tried to rebel, and mercy had let it. The day of inspection arrived under a pale sun. The officers signed the final paperwork. Margaret stood beside Lila as the crate was prepared. When Shadow stepped inside, untranquilized, unafraid, she realized that wildness wasn't about distance, it was about choice. He looked at her once before the door closed. It wasn't a farewell. It was a thank you. In the sanctuary of laws and love, Lila learned that freedom isn't granted by keeping, it's honored by letting go. The morning of the release began with silence. No wind, no birds, just the cold breath of dawn moving through the pine trees. It felt as though even the forest knew what was about to happen. Trucks lined the trail that led to the Superior National Forest Release Zone, a stretch of wilderness chosen for its remoteness, its distance from towns, roads, and fences. The snow there was untouched, the rivers clear, the only trails those carved by deer and wind. Lila stood near the back of the transport vehicle, her gloved hands clenched against the metal gate. Inside the crate, Shadow was awake, calm, his golden eyes watching everything and nothing. He'd grown into his full size now. The limp was still there, subtle, almost noble. He carried his scars like medals. Margaret's voice was steady, professional, as she briefed the small crew. Once the crate opens, no sound, no sudden movement. Step back, 10 meters. Let him choose his path. Lila listened, but her thoughts drowned beneath a flood of memories. The first night in the infirmary, the storms they survived, the laughter between silences. It all led here, the edge of the wild, the edge of goodbye. When the time came, Margaret nodded. "Lila," she said softly, "you should be the one." Lila froze. "Me, he trusts you. Let him hear your voice one last time." Her throat tightened, but she stepped forward. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. She crouched beside the crate, fingers tracing the latch. "Hey, Shadow," she whispered. "Remember the snow. You're going back to it now." For a moment, he didn't move. Then his tail flicked once, not a wag, but a signal. He knew. She lifted the latch. The door creaked open. Shadow stepped forward, one paw sinking into the snow. He sniffed the air muscles rippling beneath his coat, and then, without hesitation, he walked out. No rush, no panic. He moved with the calm certainty of something finally returning home. When he reached the tree line, he stopped, turned back. Their eyes met, not for long, just long enough to bridge every moment between then and now. And in that stillness, Lila understood. He wasn't saying farewell. He was saying thank you for setting me free. Shadow lowered his head, brushed his muzzle against the air, and disappeared into the woods. The wind returned, gentle and endless. The team began to pack up. Margaret placed a hand on Lila's shoulder. "You did right by him," she said. Lila nodded, unable to speak. Her gloves were wet with melted snow, or maybe tears. When she finally looked up again, the forest was empty except for one faint trail of paw prints leading north. That night, back at the sanctuary, Lila lay awake listening to the wind. For years she had feared silence. It always meant someone was gone. But now, it sounded different. Peaceful. Complete. Somewhere out there, a wolf with a crooked leg was finding his place beneath the moon. And for the first time in her life, Lila didn't feel left behind. She walked outside before dawn. The world shimmered under frost. At the edge of the enclosure, she paused the same spot where she'd once met him, through the crate slats. She closed her eyes and whispered into the cold air, "Run, far Shadow. And don't look back." A sound answered her, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A howl rising through layers of forest and fog. It echoed across the valley, through her bones, into her heart. She smiled. That morning, the orphan girl and the broken wolf finally walked separate paths, yet somehow they never truly left each other. 10 winters came and went. The sanctuary changed. New faces arrived. Old ones moved on. Buildings were repaired. Fences rebuilt, maps redrawn. Only the forest stayed the same, vast, patient, and eternal. And in that stillness, another life unfolded. Lila Anders was 20 now. Her name appeared not on volunteer rosters, but on federal reports and conservation grants. She'd become a licensed wildlife rescuer, specializing in reintroduction programs across the upper Midwest. Her childhood had taught her more than any textbook could, that healing isn't an act of power, but of patience. One morning, a radio call came through, static mixed with urgency. Unit 12 to base. We've got a sighting. Female wolf limping north ridge of Superior. She's guarding a den. Possible injury. Lila froze. A female. Limping. Near Superior. She tried to calm her pulse, telling herself it couldn't be, that a decade was a lifetime in the wild, but reason faltered beneath instinct. By afternoon, she was driving north. The site was remote, a valley cut by a river, silent, except for wind moving through tall grass. Local rangers had set up a perimeter, watching from a distance. In the clearing below, a lone wolf stood guard over a den dug beneath fallen roots. She was larger than Lila remembered, her coat deepened to charcoal and silver, and her left foreleg still carried the faint curve of an old scar. Lila's breath caught. It was impossible. And yet it wasn't. The rangers whispered, "She's protecting pups. Looks like 3, maybe 4. Trapped her paw in an old snare. Won't let us get close." They prepared tranquilizers, but Lila stopped them. "Let me try first," she said. She's wild." Lila nodded. "That's exactly why she'll remember." The distance between them closed slowly, 5 meters, then 3. The wolf's ears flattened, a low rumble vibrating in her chest. Lila stopped, crouched low, eyes down, voice barely above the wind. "Shadow," she whispered. The sound carried softly more memory than word. The wolf froze. The growl faltered. Then, as if something long buried stirred awake, her ears lifted. Lila removed her glove, extended her bare hand. No sudden move, no expectation, just offering space like she had years ago in the snow. Seconds passed. Then the wolf stepped forward. Just once. Just enough for her nose to brush against Lila's fingertips. It was the same warmth, the same quiet miracle of recognition. She worked quickly, cutting the snare from Shadow's paw with a small field knife, careful not to startle her. The wire slipped free, leaving a shallow wound, nothing compared to the old scar beside it. Shadow didn't flinch. She just stared at her, calm, powerful, unafraid. When it was done, the wolf stepped back, her pups pressing against her chest. For a long, silent moment, they looked at each other. 2 survivors bound not by ownership, but by something older trust. Lila whispered, "You did it. You made it." Shadow blinked slowly, then turned toward the forest. She paused once more, looked back, and with a soft sound almost like a sigh, disappeared into the trees. The rangers said nothing. Even the wind seemed to still, as if reluctant to break what had just passed. Lila stayed kneeling in the clearing long after the wolves were gone. The grass swayed around her, golden and endless. And for the first time in years, she didn't cry. She smiled. Because this was what love looked like, not a reunion of possession, but of witness. She didn't need to touch or call or follow. Just knowing Shadow was alive, leading her own pack, was enough. That night she wrote in her field log, confirmed ID. Adult female, partial deformity on left foreleg, otherwise healthy. Behavior protective, aware, non-aggressive. Notes. Recognized human voice. Recognition appeared mutual. She paused before signing her name. Then beneath it, she added one line. "Once a wolf finds its way into your heart, it never leaves. Years had passed, but in that clearing time folded in on itself. The orphan girl had become the rescuer and the broken wolf a mother of her own. The circle was complete. In the wild, nothing truly ends, it only transforms. Snow becomes river, river becomes forest, and every heartbeat, whether human or wolf, echoes inside something larger than itself. Lila learned that truth the hard way through loss, through waiting, through the quiet ache of letting go. But as the years unfolded, she came to see that love was never meant to cage what was born to roam. It was meant to give it the strength to return. Shadow's story wasn't just about survival. It was about what happens when two broken lives meet, and instead of clinging to each other's pain, they build a bridge toward freedom. In time, she became a mentor herself, teaching others the same lessons Margaret once taught her. Respect their space. Respect their wildness. You're not saving them if you make them forget who they are. And sometimes when the sun slipped below the trees and the sanctuary fell quiet, she'd walk to the edge of the clearing where she first met Shadow. If the wind was right, she could almost hear a distant howl threading through the pines, soft, steady, alive. She never knew if it was real or just memory, but either way, it was enough. The circle of life doesn't promise permanence. It promises connection, the kind that survives distance, silence, and time. Every creature we heal, every bond we form, becomes part of that great circle. Even when we let go, the love remains woven into the sound of the wind, the curve of a paw print, the whisper of leaves. So when people asked her if it was worth it, the heartbreak, the endless goodbyes, Lila always smiled. Of course, she'd say, because every release is a reminder that we're not separate from nature. We're part of its rhythm, the giving, the losing, the returning. And for those who listened closely enough, Shadow's story wasn't just about wolves. It was about us, our need to nurture, to belong, to understand the language of things we cannot keep. Because somewhere between the fences we build and the wilds we fear, there's a bridge, and sometimes that bridge is a single act of compassion. If you ever find yourself in the forests of Minnesota, listen carefully. When the wind moves through the pines, you might hear a faint call, a song carried through time. It's the sound of a wolf once rescued, now free. And maybe, just maybe, a reminder that kindness leaves an echo, one that never fades. If this story touched your heart, help us keep others like it alive. Support your local sanctuaries. Protect the wild places that still remember their song. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild Wolf Tales, where every rescue, every howl, every return reminds us that love in its truest form always leads back to freedom.